Hello, Now Playing listeners, and happy Halloween. Thought since it was Halloween that we might give you a treat of a fun-sized podcast today. Not a very long show, but this was a request made on Twitter, or I guess it's now called X. If you've been following us on Twitter or on the Facebook Now Playing group, you may know that this October, I've been going through a bit of a Nightmare on Elm Street phase. Our Alamo Drafthouse cinemas have opened back up down here, I'm really happy to say, and they showed 3 of the Nightmare on Elm Street films. They showed the original, which I had seen in theaters before, but decided to go back and see it again. They showed Dream Warriors, which I'd never seen in theaters before, and then they showed Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which I hadn't seen since we reviewed that film back in 2010. Thought I'd give it a reevaluation, see it with fresh eyes. Spoiler alert, I thought the same about it now as I did in 2010, and you can hear that review in the Now Playing podcast archives. But in addition to seeing these films on the big screen, it's really reinvigorated my Freddy fandom that you can hear me talk about on the podcasts. No, I didn't wear cosplay to any of the screenings, but I've been listening to the soundtracks. I've been watching interviews because the 40th anniversary 4K Nightmare on Elm Street disc just came out. So Robert Englund and Heather Langenkamp have been all around on social media promoting that release. And I just found myself going deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole of researching things that I started to wonder about these movies. And strangely enough, I started to hyperfixate on the modulation they did to Freddy's voice in the various films. If you've ever heard Robert Englund speak, it is not with a Freddy voice. Even when he does the Freddy character, here you can hear him talking as Freddy. It doesn't sound like Freddy.
Robert Englund! Bobby Englund! What do I think of that wimp? That loser? That Screen Actors Guild peanut? He's lucky to be alive.
And I really noticed this because in Dream Warriors, there's the scene where he's fighting Will with the wheelchair, and the voice modulation is all over the place there. It sounds like, honestly, a record player that can't keep the same speed going.
Will, you look tired. Have a seat. But when you wake up, it's back in the saddle again. It's the chair for you, kid!
So I started to research this a little bit and ended up buying Robert Englund's autobiography. It's called Hollywood Monster, A Walk Down Elm Street with the Man of Your Dreams, written by Robert Englund with Alan Goldshire. And this is a book that came out back in 2009, and I picked it up when it was a new release. I've had it autographed by Robert Englund, but I'm ashamed to say I never read it. So I picked it up because I found a Google search that said the voice recordings were discussed in this book. So I got it for Kindle, did a search, found like 3 sentences where he discussed some of the modulation they did back then with the analog equipment. Not a lot of actual information about the voice changing, but I kept going down the rabbit hole. I'm like, okay, I read a few sentences about how he almost turned down Nightmare on Elm Street 5 because he was feeling burned out. And then how some of the makeup got stuck on him due to the fire stunt in Nightmare on Elm Street 2. And I was kind of skimming the book back and forth and finally realized, crap, I might as well just read this thing. And I was talking about it on Twitter when teacher in Rhode Island said he'd like to hear a review of the book when I was done. And so I thought, it's Halloween. I'm feeling very Nightmare on Elm Street-y, so let's talk about this book, even if it is a little bit out of date. Robert Englund looking at his own career and life. And honestly, it wasn't that hard to do, because I was reading the Nightmare on Elm Street parts anyway, and then I said, okay, let me go back to the beginning of the book and just start reading it from beginning to end. And this is a very, very short book. I read the entire thing in about 2 hours. It just isn't a very difficult read. It's very plain spoken and just goes down really easy. But also, it is a short book. In print, it's 314 pages. I read the Kindle edition. I have to imagine in order to be 314 pages, they're using some pretty large print because, again, this book feels very breezy. It feels like the type of thing you might take on a flight to read and you'll be done before touchdown. The book starts with a couple of forewords. First from Wes Craven, of course. That would make a lot of sense to talk about the actor who he hired to play Freddy Krueger. And then another one by Tobe Hooper, who directed a memorable episode of Freddy's Nightmares, also directed Robert Englund in a 70s horror film called Eaten Alive, and let's not forget Tobe Hooper and Robert Englund would re-team for The Mangler, which Hooper said ended up being one of his favorite films. So, again, you can go to the Now Playing archives and hear what Stuart Jacob and I thought of that Stephen King adaptation, but Tobe Hooper liked it well enough. But then we get into Robert Englund writing in first person, discussing his life. And each chapter, he starts by recounting one of his own nightmares, one that he remembers from his childhood or a recurring nightmare he may have had throughout life. And I understand why he would do that. Freddy Krueger being associated with nightmares. I can't say any of them are particularly interesting or insightful, and they are merely just brief paragraph introductions to each chapter. Then the book goes on and starts talking about his early life, growing up in California, and being interested in girls. And that is going to be a theme that's going to come up a lot early on in this book, is he was a horny teenager. Why did he get into drama? Because there were cute girls there, and he wanted to meet some of them. He talked about the parties that actors had, and how the ratio of girls to guys were better at the drama clubs than they were at the frat parties. Really, it seems like his libido led him into acting, and he was acting before any training. Did he meet any of the girls along the way? Did he have any formative relationships? Robert Englund isn't going to get very personal in this book. There's going to be some anecdotes from his personal life, but by and large, this is going to be an exploration of Robert's career, his acting, his training, his schooling, and his jobs in film and television. So, in these early pages, he talks about there being cute girls, and he talks about one named Stephanie, but by and large, he's going to talk about the jobs he took, like playing Pinocchio. And there is possibly one of the book's failings, is that Robert Englund is going to treat this book almost like he is providing you a list of acting references. Maybe he pulled up some very old acting resumes with various shows and films he'd performed in, and that spurred his memory of certain things that happened there, certain auditions he had, but it does feel like he's keeping the reader at arm's length. You're not going to find out a lot about his life. You'll find out that he hung out with a stepsister, and the stepsister's boyfriend taught him to surf, and he's going to reference surfing quite a bit throughout the book. But how did that affect him? How did that change him? What did that expose him to? It doesn't really come up other than bringing up a various party here or there. The fact that the stepsister I mentioned isn't actually a stepsister, it was his parents' goddaughter whose parents died and then came to live with Robert and his parents. What kind of relationship did they have? What was that like, having a somewhat stranger move into your house? How did that affect your dynamic with your parents? What were your relationships with your parents like? These are the types of things you kind of expect to get in an autobiography. They're maybe a little bit indulgent, but you want to get to know the person who you're reading about. You want to know some of their life, and this book is not going to be that. This book is going to talk about going to various auditions, taking drama classes in high school, and eventually going to California State University and trying their drama school. And he does tell a couple of personal stories. Like, right before going to college, he talks about a argument he had with his parents where he ended up, as he calls it, running away from home. I don't know if it's really running away if you're 18 years old or if it's just moving out, but he says he ran away from home and wouldn't speak to his parents for a while. And that is literally one paragraph. You would think something like that would have an impact on a person. Maybe it would create sense memories that he could call upon as an actor later in life. But no, he's just going to give it a paragraph, and then later on he'll mention how a year later he and his father reconnected, and neither one really apologized. There were no amends made. They just kept moving on with life, which I understand that. But it's just kind of interesting that there's no self-indulgence, let's talk about me. It all comes down to, let's talk about my roles. And I have to wonder if that's what Robert Englund thinks everybody is here for. Let's talk about my roles. When you go and meet Robert Englund at a convention, there's a huge line to see him. It is absolutely immense. It is always the longest line at any convention I go to. I think one time I lucked out and was able to just walk right up and get an autograph, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to be in that line 6-7 hours to meet him, and every single person who goes up there wants to talk to him about a role. Probably it's usually Freddy. One time I did get up there and ask him about the Mangler. You can hear me talk about that in our 3rd Mangler podcast, but people are there to talk to him because they liked him in a show. They liked him in a movie. So those are the stories he's probably most used to relating, and that's what he's going to focus on in this book. And I bring up Robert Englund's convention appearances not by accident, because if you meet Robert Englund, and I have been fortunate to do so many times, I interviewed him once. You can hear that interview in the Now Playing archives. It was at San Diego Comic-Con in his suite. I can't remember what he was promoting now, but we talked about Freddy. We talked about his voiceover work. Jacob and I and Robert Englund sharing some time and discussing various projects. And I'll never forget, he talked about how he was out late the night before partying with Ludacris, which is a ludicrous idea to me to see those two together. But if you meet Robert Englund at a con, there's a reason his lines are long. When you get up to meet the man, he's going to look you in the eye, he's going to shake your hand, and he's going to spend a little bit of time talking with you. And I'm sure he's very practiced at how long he spends and knows just how long to make it so that you feel like you're getting a real interaction with him and getting not just a signature, which you can order off his website, but getting to meet Robert Englund. And he's going to give you an anecdote. And this guy, he knows film, he knows literature. I remember when I got the Mangler signed by Robert Englund, he told me that he took his inspiration for that character from the film The Lady from Shanghai, which was an Orson Welles and Rita Hayworth film from the 40s. This guy knows movies and draws upon unlikely sources, and he blew my mind when he told me that at a Comic-Con about the Mangler of all things. And honestly, I couldn't have told you which movie it was, except he tells that same anecdote here in the book. And it came to me that that's kind of what this book feels like, is being so short and spending so little time on most of his projects. They feel like bite-sized anecdotes that Robert Englund has probably honed after time and time and time again of telling these stories at conventions. Having 2 to 3 minutes to spend with a guest and enrapturing them with a tale of working on Stay Hungry with Arnold Schwarzenegger, or the Roger Corman film Galaxy of Terror, where he met James Cameron, the time he attempted to audition for Apocalypse Now and didn't get that role and was told to go over and audition to be Han Solo in Star Wars, didn't get that role, but told his friend at the time, Mark Hamill, hey, there's this film called Star Wars you might want to go try for, which is another anecdote that Robert Englund told Jacob and I when we interviewed him at Comic-Con. And I will say, a lot of the stories seem fairly name-droppy, but not in a bad, he's trying to brag that he knew this person kind of way, but more in a, I have been places and gotten to meet interesting people, like when he saw James Cameron as the art director on Galaxy of Terror, or when in college he was trying out for a part and the person who auditioned right before him was Richard Dreyfuss, who would drop out of school very shortly after that and go on to become quite famous in his own right. Or about a time when a stunt went wrong and he almost deafened and possibly killed Burt Reynolds on a set. And again, I think he's doing this because these are going to be people the reader has heard about, and so the reader may be more interested in these stories because it's not just about Robert, it's about Robert and Burt Reynolds, or it's about Robert and Gary Busey. But again, none of these tales of working on his early films, Buster and Billy, Stay Hungry, Galaxy of Terror, Don't Cry, It's Only Thunder, some of these I'd heard of, some of these I hadn't. He doesn't spend a lot of time on any of them. And my thinking while reading this is, all right, he knows what people are here for. They're here for Freddy. Well, he is going to spend a little bit of time on one other character before he gets to Freddy. When you are, what Kindle tells me is 31% into the book, Robert Englund talks about the first time he became a star instead of just a working actor, and that's when he was playing Willie, the friendly alien on V. And he talks about what that was like getting hired for the miniseries, meeting with the Incredible Hulk producer Kenneth Johnson, who did V, and that Kenneth Johnson wanted a Gene Wilder type performance for Willie, and what it was like to get internationally known for that miniseries and have it happen almost overnight because it aired on television and everybody had seen it by the next morning. So when I say he spent a bit of time discussing this, it's maybe 6% of the book, again, according to Kindle, because by the time you're at 37%, V was on a filming hiatus. Robert Englund was looking for a movie that would fit in that time when he wasn't filming V, and the only thing that fit that time happened to be a very low-budget indie horror film, A Nightmare on Elm Street. And so here we are, over a third into the book, but the book is called A Walk Down Elm Street with the Man of Your Dreams. So you think, okay, we're going to focus on Freddy. Robert Englund recently said that he's come to terms with the fact that when he dies, Freddy Krueger will be the top line of his obituary. It's the role with which he's most associated. So let's talk about Freddy. And he does. But, again, like anything, it just feels so brief. I think I spent maybe 10 minutes reading about the first film, and the stories he told, I'm torn because I'm sure there are stories that are obligatory. If you know nothing about Robert Englund, you probably should know that when he first went in to meet Wes Craven, he tried to go a little bit method and not blink and be a little weird and off kilter and try to convince this guy, I am Freddy Krueger, that he really wanted that role. By the same token, that's the same story he's been telling everyone since 1984. So I'm hearing it in a first-person perspective, maybe with a little bit more detail, but it's not scratching beneath the surface. It is just another anecdote. And when he goes through his work on A Nightmare on Elm Street, you have to think that could be an entire book on its own. His memories of being on A Nightmare on Elm Street and what it was like to work with the makeup effects and work with the various other prosthetics he had to have, what it was like seeing that movie for the first time, interpersonal relationships, and he glosses over it. He talks a little bit about how he got a little angry in the makeup chair one time and saw that Heather Langenkamp and Johnny Depp didn't have to go through the makeup, and he was jealous of them and how pretty they were, and that informed his performance as Freddy. But it just didn't feel like it went into enough depth. And if the first film doesn't go deep enough, a lot of the sequels feel really glossed over. I feel like there are stories that, again, are just anecdotal that he probably gets great reactions to when he tells them on stage and panels or on talk shows of when he went to a restaurant and forgot he had the Freddy Krueger makeup on and the waiter freaked out and then was never seen again, whether he was scared or whether he was fired because he dropped a plate of food, or the time that they'd shot until early morning the next day, and he and makeup man Kevin Yeager went to a food truck to get some food, and he ended up buying food for a transgender prostitute. Interesting stories all. Brief and without much emotional impact, though. This isn't to say I didn't learn anything while reading this book. A lot of these anecdotes, like the transgender prostitute, or the time fans surrounded his trailer and almost rolled it over because they were pushing on it so hard to get him to come out and sign autographs. Hadn't heard those stories, but they didn't give insight into the man, the myth, or the movie. And it circles right back around to the reason I started reading this book and purchased it to begin with, was to learn about the voice process. I knew that wasn't going to be a huge part of the book, but it's yet just another quick anecdote that I hadn't heard before. This book is full of them, and like meeting Robert Englund at a con, they're all enjoyable. There's nothing wrong with any of these stories. It's like eating popcorn during a Nightmare on Elm Street film. When you're done with the movie, do you really remember the popcorn? Did you really experience the popcorn, or was it just something that was good at the time? And that's where I am with this book, is it was just something that was an easy read, a fun read, but it leaves no lingering memory. I didn't learn anything about Robert Englund. I mean, when he's talking about his personal life, according to Wikipedia, he's been married 3 times. He does discuss his first marriage to Elizabeth Gardner. In passing, they divorced in 1972 before he really even had any movie roles. He talks about getting married and how they moved together to the Midwest so he could attend drama school, and that basically he chose his career over his marriage. But then his second wife, Roxanne Rogers, who he married after Nightmare on Elm Street 2, he married her in 86 and divorced her around the time of Elm Street 4 in 88. She doesn't get a mention in this book at all. That's how little insight we're getting into Englund's personal life. He does talk for a few pages about meeting his current wife of over 30 years, Nancy Booth, who was a set decorator on his directorial debut 976 Evil. And if you were interested in 976 Evil, you're not going to get a whole lot of information about that movie, but you will get a couple of pages about how he fell in love with the set decorator. And when I say this book doesn't get personal, it doesn't just not get personal about Robert Englund. He's not here to spill the tea on anyone. If you're looking to find out which celebrities he's encountered that are assholes, or maybe which celebrities don't wear deodorant, which ones have been rude to him, which ones stepped on him on their way up, none of that's going to be in here. This is all going to be very vanilla stories that aren't going to ruffle any feathers. And I think that's why Robert Englund doesn't get too personal about his own life either. He's not here to gossip, and we know those stories are out there. For Nightmare's 30th anniversary, Slate.com did a oral history on the first Nightmare on Elm Street film, and Robert Englund told a very funny story about how he was grand marshal of a parade and he was doing it as Freddy, and two super hot women propositioned him, and that night they asked him to keep the glove on. That's a funny story that he told to Slate that he leaves out of his autobiography. What impact did Freddy fame have on him in ways like that? Book's not going to get into that. It's going to focus on the movies. But even if it doesn't go very in-depth about the movies, the Nightmare on Elm Street period is about half the book. It started at about 37% and ended at 86%. So literally 50% of the book is going to be glossing over the Nightmare on Elm Street films. And again, I was such a huge fan of those films in the 80s and 90s. I've read so many Fangoria articles and making of books and things. I don't know what I wanted Robert Englund to give me that I didn't have already from those books, but something else. And also there were a couple of times that I was kind of frustrated because, at least in the Kindle version, which is what I'm reviewing, everything is prose. But he will go on at length about photographs. Like, when he was filming Nightmare on Elm Street 1 and had to then go directly to a photo shoot for V for TV Guide, and that his face was puffy because of the makeup glue and he had bad hair. And so now I find myself pausing the book to start doing a Google image search of TV Guide V photo shoot so I can see what he's trying to describe about his complexion being a problem during this photo. I found the photo, didn't notice anything. And then he talks briefly in Nightmare on Elm Street 3 about how there was that nurse character who reveals herself to be Freddy, and there was a period where they had put Freddy makeup on this woman. She was topless, but had kind of a Robert Englund face, and that he sees this photo at conventions. I'd never seen that photo, so now I'm doing a Google image search of topless nurse dream warriors. It's really strange search history. But it was all inspired by this book not having the photos that he's trying to describe in words. And literally, a picture is worth 1,000 words. At the very end of the book, there are some photographs of Robert Englund throughout his life. His wedding in 1988, the set of The Mangler, Freddy vs. Jason, on the set of Married with Children. None of these are the ones he's describing. I'm guessing that either he couldn't get rights or didn't want to pay for the specific TV Guide photo. But it was a little frustrating that picture is so important to Robert Englund, and yet we're left with prose. And when he's done talking about the Nightmare on Elm Street films, including Freddy vs. Jason, then you get to the epilogue. And, you know, Robert Englund has had a big career outside of Nightmare on Elm Street. Yes, it is mostly horror stuff, and not all of it is so beloved. I now remember the movie we interviewed Robert Englund for, Zombie Strippers, in 2008. Yes, that is the movie that got us access to interview Freddy Krueger. But whether it's that, or Hatchet, 2001 Maniacs, Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, these are films that have fan bases, and they're not going to get very much mention at all. He does list them out, but when you are done talking about Freddy vs. Jason, you're at 86% of the book. Well, once you get to 92% of the book, all of a sudden you're in appendices, and it's going to be movies Robert Englund suggests you watch, or movies that he thinks Freddy Krueger would think you should watch, and his favorite lines and kills as Freddy, and music to listen to if you're thinking about Freddy. And so the book was done in, honestly, about the same time it takes to watch a Nightmare on Elm Street movie. It went down easy. It was a fun read. Do I recommend it? That really depends on how much you like Robert Englund. I think the flaw of this book is that not only doesn't it go deep into him as a person, but it has a presumed empathy that you know who you're reading about and you already care about him and his filmography. Let me contrast this with what I would consider the gold standard of horror film autobiographies, and that would be Bruce Campbell's If Chins Could Kill, Confessions of a B-Movie Actor. I barely knew who Bruce Campbell was when that book came out in 2002. I'd seen him in stuff, but I was more interested in the Confessions of a B-Movie Actor part than I was in learning about Bruce Campbell. And as I'm reading the book, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. He was in McHale's Navy. And oh, that's right. It's that guy from Congo. But when I read If Chins Could Kill, I learned a lot about Bruce Campbell as a person. I learned about his life growing up. I learned about his relationships. There was some name dropping. There was some movie discussion, some of which went more in depth than others. It was entertaining, but I didn't care about Bruce Campbell as a person or an actor when I bought that book, and I walked away from that book as a Bruce Campbell fan. And here, I feel if you're reading this Robert Englund Hollywood Monster book, it's got to be like meeting him at a con. You've got to already be a fan and go in, get your few minutes, your little anecdotes, and walk away equally a fan of the person. Which is to say there's nothing wrong with Hollywood Monster, other than some egregious typos that I found in the Kindle edition. But I can't say it's a must-read either, and it exists only for Robert Englund fans, which I am one. I've stood in those lines many times. I've sat and watched him give talks at panels, so I am the target audience. I enjoyed the book, but I walk away from it feeling mostly ambivalent. It went down so quickly, I'm not going to remember a whole lot about it a year from now. Perhaps the worst thing is that there isn't an audiobook version of this biography where you could hear Robert Englund himself telling the stories. I know back in 2009 when this came out, Audible isn't what it is now, where it feels like everybody is doing their own readings of their autobiographies, and they even hired Cheryl Lee to come back and record the diary of Laura Palmer. I guess in 2009, that wasn't as big a deal. I think hearing Robert Englund tell these stories would have been far more impactful and enjoyable than reading them. But if we don't have an audiobook, there is something else that I didn't know about until I started doing research for this book review. Last year came out Hollywood Dreams and Nightmares, the Robert Englund story, a slightly over 2-hour documentary on Robert Englund and his film career. And I'll tell you something interesting about that movie. As I watched it, I'm like, well, this is the book. So many of the anecdotes in that movie are directly in the book. It almost feels like the movie is an adaptation of that autobiography. There are a lot more details in the book, especially about the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, about Freddy's nightmares, about the fact that he almost didn't return for Nightmare 5. None of that is touched on in the Hollywood Dreams documentary, but a lot of the stories, like giving the script to Mark Hamill for Star Wars and not getting the part in Apocalypse Now and Richard Dreyfuss at the acting school, those are all told by Robert Englund himself in the Hollywood Dreams and Nightmares film. And then that is a movie. It is full of visuals. Yes, there's talking heads for a lot of it. There's some strange animations when I think they couldn't get rights to stuff. They had a cartoonist draw it. But a lot of the time, there are film clips from these movies he's talking about. So you can see the movies and see his performance, at least a line or two of it, in the documentary that you couldn't get out of the book. I also think the documentary lets us know more about Robert Englund himself by counterintuitively not focusing completely on Robert Englund. There's a lot of people in that documentary. Yes, you expect Heather Langenkamp to show up and Amanda Wyss, but you get Bill Moseley, Tony Todd, Kane Hodder, Mick Garris, Eli Roth, the directors and writers and actors on Robert's films talking about him and getting information to the viewer about Robert as a person that Robert himself doesn't give in an autobiography. the way Robert is always very gracious to new actors when he meets them on set and seemingly knows everybody's entire resume and knows their best films, and even if they were minor roles. These are the kinds of stories that make Robert Englund a person to be valued, and you don't get them in his own book, but you get it in the reflection of Robert Englund as told by his co-stars, his co-workers, his wife. So I can easily give Hollywood Dreams and Nightmares a recommend, even though this is a book review. If you want to know about Robert Englund's career, I'd say check out that documentary film before you check out this book. And then if you want to know more and accept that there's going to be a Venn diagram where over half is overlapping stories that are in the book and in the movie, then go ahead and pick up this book as well. But you gotta like Robert Englund. If you're just a fan of A Nightmare on Elm Street, I think you're gonna be left a little bit disappointed. There's just not enough depth of content here. So with that, I will again wish you a happy Halloween, and thank you for listening to one of the rare now playing book review bonus shows we do here. There may be some more of these coming up, and don't count out that someday I might show up unexpectedly with a review of Firestarter, the long-awaited next installment in the Stephen King book series. I still have hopes to do that, I just need to find the time. But I was able to squeeze in this quick show because it was such a quick book to read and not a whole lot of content to really dissect. So thank you for listening, sweet dreams, happy Halloween, and I hope you'll join us this Friday for our review of another 80s horror, fun, trashy film, The Hidden. It's coming out for Gold Donors. We'll talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to this Now Playing Podcast review. We hope you enjoyed the show. Now Playing Podcast is produced and edited by Arnie Carvalho. The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual hosts and may not reflect the views of Venganza Media Incorporated. All movie clips and music included in this podcast are the intellectual property of their respective copyright holders. They are included here for the purpose of review and no infringement is intended. Now Playing Podcast is an exclusive trademark of and may not be used without the express written permission of Venganza Media Incorporated. Now Playing is a Venganza Media production, copyright 2024, and no part of this show may be reproduced, repurposed, or redistributed without the written permission of Venganza Media Incorporated. All rights reserved.